Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth seminar session about sources in foreign archives for the study of Portuguese history. Today, we're going to know more about the Tuscan archives with Professor Francesco Guidi-Bruscoli, which I start to say thanks in the name of the organization. And thanks as well to all the participants here. So, I will begin with a brief presentation about Professor Guidi-Bruscoli, and then he will start his seminar. In the end, we will have time for a debate and some questions. Dr. Francesco Guidi-Bruscoli gained his degree at the Faculty of Economics, University of Florence. After an MA in later medieval studies at Royal Holloway University of London, he obtained his PhD in economic history at University of Bari. His thesis won the Young Scholar Prize of European Association for Banking History. In 2002-2004, he was at Queen Mary, University of London, as a research assistant at the Bartolomeo Bank Research Project. Since 2005, teaches economic history at University of Florence, and he is a senior research fellow of the History Department of Queen Mary. In 2007, was visiting professor at University of Paris 7, and he is associate member of Academia de Marinha from Portugal. He is also academic correspondente estrangeiro of the Academia Portuguesa da História and investigador correspondente estrangeiro of SHAM at Nova University of Lisbon. Dr. Guidi-Bruscoli's main research interests focus on the activity of Italian merchant bankers between 14th and 16th centuries. Among his many other works, highlight the book Bartolomeo Marchionni, Homem de Grossa Fazenda, mercante fiorentino a Lisbona e l'Império Portuguese, and the article Da comprimaria protagonisti e fiorentini in Portugal nel Basso Medioevo. His book on Marchionni won the Prêmio Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian for História da Europa. And now, Professor, when you want.
Thank you very much, Anna. And then thanks to Flavio, to Mandio, organizers of this cycle of seminars, and thanks to CITSEM for hosting it, although online, and obviously I regret not being able to join you, for those of you who are in Porto, although I'm sure that in this way we'll have a wider audience than in present. So in a few minutes, I will share my presentation. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Now I just introduced this seminar, which will last sometime in the region of 45 to 50 minutes, as the organizer told me to. So the theme is Tuscan sources for the study of late medieval, and I would add very early modern Portuguese history. My link with Portugal started very early in my career as a researcher, because I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the Codice Valiente, and I will discuss this source later on. At the time when I wrote my thesis, undergraduate theses were quite long, and it took me more than a year to transcribe the document and then to make a comment about it. Now, two editions of this source have been published in the early 2000s, but back then no publication existed of the Codice Valiente. After this, I tried to see whether a PhD project on the relations between Florence and Portugal was viable, but I couldn't find a group of sources that gave me enough confidence to do it, in a sense. Therefore, I abandoned Portugal and wrote my PhD on something else, so on papal finances. But Portugal was always on my mind, and eventually in 2012, I spent some time in Lisbon to complement research that I had already started in Florence. Then I went back to Lisbon the following year, and eventually in 2014, I published a book on Bartolomeo Marchionni, as Anna said. And I must say that this was about the right time to do it, because as I will show you, sources are so scattered that I don't think I would have been able to do it without prior research experience. So it wouldn't have been a good PhD project. Since the publication of the book on Marchionni, I have continued to write about Luso-Italian relations, and in particular about Italian merchants in Portugal. So now, before my actual presentation, just a couple of caveats. First of all, in showing the sources today, I will mainly deal with mercantile sources, that is, letters, journals, or accounts written by merchants. Second, I will not be dealing with trade between Italy and Portugal. So this is not going to be an economic history of the relations between Portugal and Italy in the late Middle Ages, but I will only talk about sources dealing with this trade through a period of time that goes from the end of the 14th century to the first quarter of the 16th century. I will obviously give some insights into the presence of Italian merchants in Portugal, but only in as much as they are instrumental to justify the existence of the sources or group of sources that I'm going to be talking about. Thirdly, I will not discuss bibliography in depth, although before me several scholars have dealt with the presence of Italian in Portugal based on both Italian and Portuguese sources, from the pioneering work by Peragallo to then Rao and Melis, and then Radulet Spallanzani, and many others even in recent years, because studies on Luso-Italian relations are very much alive, also as demonstrated by the annual cycles of conferences, the Luso-Italianas organized at CHAP. So I will start by sharing my presentation now. First of all, one comment about the survival of sources in Tuscany and in Florence in particular. It must be said that the survival of mercantile sources in Florence exceeds by far the survival in any other place in the Italian peninsula. And there is a multiplicity of reasons for that. I will not discuss them here, but let me just point one of them. That is the fact that at least until the emergence of the Grand Dukedom around the middle of the 16th century, there was a certain degree of social mobility in Florence. And this mobility largely depended on the capability to create wealth from the traditional pillars, I would say, of Florentine society, such as trade, banking, and manufacturing, and in particular textile manufacturing. After the 15th century, this mobility was lessened in the sense that society became more rigid, but still the Florentine model was different from the aristocratic model that, for example, characterized Venice, where the belonging to aristocracy was established by law. Whereas in Florence, in a sense, it had to be negotiated, and even in the early modern period, so under the Grand Duke, when a nobility emerged, this was based on prestige and on the prosperity attained in the late Middle Ages. And it is to demonstrate such results, therefore, that those families carefully kept and preserved their archives within their own palaces. So this is part of the justification for the survival of so many sources. Looking at Florence in brief, we can say mercantile tradition, the presence of Florentine merchants abroad, because they relocated in the main commercial and banking marketplaces of Europe, and the existence of commercial networks. They were dealing with each other. They were continuously communicating with each other, conveying investments where it looked more So I will now start by talking about the mercantile letters in general, and then move on more specifically on the Portuguese case. So I will say a few words about the Italians in Portugal in the 14th and 15th century, as I said, just to justify the existence of sources in Tuscany relating to the history of Portugal. I will then deal with the early years of the 16th century, and so say something about the Florentine collaboration in the Portuguese Cavalleria da India. And I will conclude by drawing your attention to a case study that, as Anna and I both said, I investigated in depth, and that is the case study of Bartolomeo, so one of the Florentine merchants who attained an amazing success in Portugal in the last decade of the 15th and the first decades of the 16th century. Concerning letter writing, many of the letters that are still surviving show that it was very much inbuilt in the mentality of merchants, the importance of writing letters. I just cite 2 or 3 here in the following slides. For example, this is an anonymous merchant of mid-14th century who said, "We cannot be lazy about writing, and in particular letters, because paper is not expensive and it often brings good profits." And Tuscans in particular, they were aware of their tendency to almost be obsessed with writing. For example, this quotation is taken from a letter exchanged within the Latini system of company. So one merchant belonging to the Latini company of Genoa writing to his colleague in Florence and referring to merchants of the north of Italy. And he said, so these other merchants, the non-Florentines, they are not merchants who write in the same way as we do. So the pen seems heavy for them. So they don't write as much as we do. Because if you flip through this letter, you find continuous references about the need to convey information. When merchants were dealing on an international level, clearly information was a very precious merchandise, which needed to be nurtured, needed to be augmented in continuation. So in all these letters, you find requests for information based upon reciprocity, obviously. So a merchant would be saying, "Send me your information, everything you know, and obviously I will reciprocate." So like in this example, when you write to me, always do it in full. How things are, what you think of them, tell me about the ships leaving the port and their load. And I will do the same with, for example, you see the 2 different extremes, in a sense, in these two quotes. The first is in a letter written by Lorenzo Strozzi in Valencia to his mother, and he says, "I don't mind writing. I'm sitting all day at the writing desk, and I copy 12 letters a day. I write so fast that you would be surprised." Whereas the sense of exhaustion comes from the letter written by Giovanni Morelli in Lisbon in 1509. So he says, "I spend all day, half of the night at the writing desk. It is very, very tiring." This attitude was not only limited to the mercantile environment, but it permeated other parts of society. And to summarize this, I conclude with a famous quote by Lucio Balestracci, who in a book written about 40 years ago, talking about peasants in the Tuscan Contado, he commented that Tuscany was a region with a pen in its hand. So everyone, or many people really, were able to write. What is the end result of this? That we have many archives with hundreds or thousands of these type of sources. Maybe the most famous for the late Middle Ages is the Latini archive in Prato, which contains about 150,000 letters, the vast majority commercial letters, plus almost 600 account books. Smaller collections scattered in public institutions like the State Archive in Florence, the National Library in Florence, but also other types of institutions like the Foundling Hospital in Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, or many private archives, because as I said, families needed to keep their sources, and they still keep it now. So there are still many Florentine families or families living in the countryside who still have their own archive in their own palace or villa. In the past decades, part of these collections were sold. It wouldn't be possible now anymore, but in the past it was. And so some American libraries, for example, preserve groups of sources produced by Florentine families like Harvard, Philadelphia, or the Beinecke at Yale, with the families Medici, Gondi, and Spinelli. Coming to Italians in Portugal, the first Tuscans to be attested in Portugal were from Pistoia, which is a town west of Florence, from the late 13th century. Although talking Italians, it is the Genoese who played a wider role at this height of time. Towards the middle of the 14th century, some Tuscans begin to appear, like Angelino del Teghiere Corpizzi, who, together with Nicoloso dal Ricco, reached the Canary Island. And also there is the mention of some members of the Bardi company who were based in Lisbon in 1338. However, at this time, Lisbon and Portugal, more broadly, were not in the main interest for Florentines, and in fact, in the famous Pratica di Mercatura, so merchant manual by Francesco Balducci Pegolotti, only few words are devoted to Lisbon. Towards the end of the 14th century, privileges were awarded to Genoese and Piacentini, so merchants from Piacenza, not to Florentines. And these demonstrate the fact that it was the Genoese and the Piacentini who were more present and more important in Lisbon. But the Datini archive preserved 6 letters written from Lisbon. If you remember, there were 125,000 letters preserved in the Latini archive, only 6 in Lisbon. So it's a very small number, but at least is a testimony. 5 of them written by Bartolomeo Manni, 1 by Bernardo di Mariano, both agents of Florentine companies based respectively in Bruges and in Genoa. All these letters have been published by Rao about 60 years ago. But if you see from the comment that I reported here, there was not much interest in trading with Portugal, because Manni said the country is in a bad state, in war, and nothing is done. Everything is expensive and things move from bad to worse. In 1414, the name of Cambini appears in Lisbon. Just bear this in mind, because I'll get back to this. With the 15th century, the Florentines organized their own state galley system, and they begin to land in Lisbon. So in the 1420s, they obtain in Lisbon the same privileges that had been conceded by the king to the other Italians who were landing at Lisbon, so the Venetians in this case. The growing interest towards Portugal is demonstrated by the 15th century merchant manuals. So if you remember, in the middle of the 14th century, just few words were devoted to Portugal. In the middle of the 15th century, there are chapters devoted to Portugal or to Lisbon by Uzzano or by Chiarini. During the reign of Afonso V, Genoese were still more numerous than Florentines, but Florentines began to obtain contracts or monopolies. For example, monopolies over the fisheries and trade of the Algarve coral, monopoly over the cork trade, a contract for the mullets fisheries, a monopoly over the mines of Abissa. As you notice, most times Florentines were not alone. So there would be a Florentine representative based in Lisbon, but often as partners, other Florentines based elsewhere, Florence, but not necessarily. Sometimes other Italians, Genoese or Venetians, at times Portuguese, or at times even foreigners like Jean Forbin of Marseille, or as we shall see later, Martin Lem, who was a Fleming based between Bruges and Lisbon. So at the middle of the 15th century, really, Florentines begin to be at ease in Portugal. And as I said, what it is interesting and what it is important to underline, because this has a reflection on sources as well, is the fact that those Florentines who were based in Lisbon basically attracted to Lisbon's investments coming from elsewhere, from Bruges, from Lyon, from Florence, etc. This reflects in the survival of sources. So, for example, the Salviati archives held a group of sources of the Nerone Salviati company of Pisa, spanning more or less 10 years. It's quite a complete documentation made of the big ledger books, so the debitorio creditori, cash books, memoirs, income and expenditure. These books were kept in Pisa, so not in Lisbon, but in Pisa, but they show extensive dealings with Lisbon. And incidentally, these are the subject of the doctoral thesis by Ana Clarinda Cardoso, who is chairing this session. Also for the same period, or slightly later, we have the sources of the Salviati da Colle. And this is quite unique, the unique case, because these are accounts kept by the Bank of Lisbon, so based in Lisbon. And this is, as I said, is a unique case. Especially important are the registers 7 and 8 of the early 1460s, but the collection consists of about 10 books. They have been studied initially by Marcello Berti, and then more recently by Joana Sequeira, who wrote a series of articles based on this material. Let me underline once again that these are particularly important because they are testimony of a company based in Lisbon. I reminded you before the name of the Campini. The Campini were particularly active in the 1450s to 70s. They had a series of agents or representatives in Lisbon, and especially many of their sources have survived. Again, this time in the Archivio dell'Ospedale degli Innocenti, which is the foundling hospital. As you see, again, the sources are sort of serialized. There are some holes, so the series is not completed, but there are most of the libri di debitorio creditori in bold here, so the big ledger books, complemented by other sources of information. This activity was not limited to Portugal, so Portugal was only a part of the interest of the Cambini, but scattered throughout all these sources, information on Portugal can be found. For example, as I will show you, the early mercantile life, so to say, of Marchionni is all documented. Here. A book on the Cambini has been published by Sergio Tognetti, who, however, did not limit his attention to Portugal, but to the whole activity of the Cambini. In addition to accounts, we have scattered ledgers. Florentines showed interest in the voyages of discovery, of exploration that the Portuguese were undertaking along the African coast in the Atlantic, and later on, obviously, in Asia. And it is interesting to underline, that's why I present this quote, that these letters were, let's say, were not only private in the sense that they had a sender, they had a specific recipient, but in a sense they could easily become public. So in this case, Benedetto the letter written by Lorenzo Tornabuoni, in a sense, who received a letter from Zenobio del Nero, was read aloud in the piazza. So this morning I was hanging around in the piazza, and there was a group of noblemen, including Zenobio del Nero. He was reading aloud a letter from Portugal, written by a friend who lives there, about the Portuguese exploration of Guinea. And this idea of private-public will come back later on, and in a sense also justifies the survival of some of these letters, who also got copied and then included into a wider collection. So coming now more specifically to the Portuguese Carreira da India, and let's say the relation of Florentine merchants with the Carreira da India. I want to start with a comment made by Guido di Tommaso Detti, a Florentine who was in Lisbon when the Vasco da Gama fleet returned after his first voyage. And Detti, writing from Lisbon to Florence, wrote, this king has ordered to conceal all the navigation maps, and he threatens with death penalty and confiscation of goods all those who give information about the coast. He does not want the route to become known because he fears that other people might want to go there. But then he concludes, I think that despite his effort, everything will become known. So, credo potrà ben fare, ma tutto sarà sapere. And this also gives the idea of the contribution that this kind of letters can make to the reconstruction of the history of this navigation. Merchants, given the interest and the almost obsession they had for the quest of information, were easily used as a source of information, not only by their own partners or fellow merchants, but more generally even by governors or governments. And sometimes they also acted as spies. For example, when Leonardo da Camacer, a Venetian, arrived in Lisbon, he was immediately arrested. And he basically blamed Bartolomeo Marchionni, accusing him of telling the king, basically, that this Venetian was coming to Lisbon to spy on the Portuguese venture. Whereas Macer, in his own words, sort of defended himself and said that, and I quote, I came here as a private citizen, just as a merchant, not as an envoy of the Signoria Nostra, so of the Venetian government. So sometimes merchants were indeed used as spies, and it is true that sometimes spies tried to disguise themselves as merchants, because merchants, let's say by default or by profession, by inclination, were people who were going around gathering information. In writing about the Colombian voyages, Gabriele Airaldi wrote that the mercantile letters are the most consistent group of information for the voyages of Columbus. And I think the same could be said for the early Carreira da India. Because foreign merchants, Florentines, Genoese, but now Florentines in particular, had indeed access to information. They had connections at court. For example, when Domenico Pisani, Venetian ambassador, got to Lisbon in 1501, he said that he went to an audience at the King's Palace, And he says, this palace is very large and beautiful, and the whole room was full of foreigners, that is, Florentines and Genoese. And the privileges given to Italians and Florentines in particular at this time are also demonstrated by this carta, which is a carta sort of assessing the merchants with the privilege of citizen of Visigno. And you see that in 1512, there were 15 names of foreigners who had become Visignos of Lisboa, and 6 of them were Italians, 4 of them were Florentines, and names that will reappear later: Leonardo Nardi, Bartolomeo Marchionni, Benedetto Morelli, and Girolamo Sermigi. What are the types of sources giving us, even modern historians, information about the Carrera da India? We can sort of group them into 3 types. First one, collection of letters. As I said, some of these letters got copied and then got collected. Probably for the early part of the Carrera da India, the most famous collection is the so-called Codice Valienti, which is preserved by the Biblioteca Riccardiana in Florence. As I said, there had been an Italian complete edition edited by Formisano, on the left here in the image. And then the letters, only the part of the letters relating to the Portuguese voyages, have been edited by Radulet and Tomas with Portuguese translation as well. Other collections are existing again in Florence, the Codice Zorzi at the National Library, and then there are some famous printed collections made in the Veneto, the Paesi Nuovamente Ritrovati and the Navigazioni e Viaggi, where part of those previous letters have been included. So one type, collection of letters. Second type, loose letters. And these are, as I will show you very soon, scattered throughout archives in Florence, but Tuscany, but not only. As you will see, Mantua as well, Venice, etc. Finally, we have accounts of Florentine companies who were in relation with Lisbon. As I said, apart from the Salviati da Colle book in the 1460s, there are no other extant account books of Florentines in Lisbon. So we need to resort to account books held elsewhere. But this is possible because, as I said, Florentine based in Lisbon became sort of conveyors of investments coming from elsewhere. So we have, for example, books of the Gondi of Florence and Lyon, books of the Pitti of Lyon, books of the Salviati of Lyon, books of the Capponi of Florence, etc. This is probably the area of investigation that can be pursued in the future, whereas the obviously letters appearing in the collections are now well known. Some more loose letters can clearly appear, but this is probably the area of investigation that can be pursued for further research, because it really information is really scattered if one wants to focus on, for example, a particular merchant. I'll just show you the case of Giovanni da Empoli, investigated by Marco Spallanzani some years ago. Giovanni da Empoli made 3 voyages towards Asia, and information about this activity, as you see, consists of a variety of sources. It can be the life written by his uncle. There are accounts of investors who invested in da Empoli's voyages through him. It can be his own reports on voyages. It can be his own letters written from Lisbon to Florence, or even from Asia to Florence. And if you see the archive where they are kept, You see that they are kept in ASF is the Archivio di Stato of Florence, the NCF is the National Library of Florence, and within the Archivio di Stato into various collections, Gondi family, notarial documents, Medici Avanti Principato, again notarial documents. So it is really a treasure hunt to try to locate all these documents. I made a sort of census on these letters written by merchants about the early voyages, so the early voyages of the first 20 years of the Carrera da India. This is a complete list. Do not worry about noting down anything. I published this table already, so I will be giving the reference. You see that these sources appear in many different collections. In red is the Codice Valienti, in green is the Codice Zorzi, and the other ones are scattered archives where these letters could be found. As I said, I published already this table with some comments in the Memorias of the Accademia da Marinha in 2016. So you can download this article, or if you need it, you can send me an email and I can send you the PDF. In general, and finally, the list includes letters not only by Florentines in Lisbon, in Asia, or traveling between the two, but also Florentines in Spain who were receiving information from the Florentines of Lisbon, and also other merchants based in Lisbon. One important merchant is Giovan Francesco Fraitati, who was a merchant from Cremona in the north of Italy. Moreover, there are also letters or reports by diplomats and ambassadors, but I will not be dealing with this now. As a general comment to these sources, what can we say? First of all, that some voyages are better documented than others. So there is a more abundant production, let's say, of documents. Very few of these letters are preserved in the original form. So the original letters preserved. Most of them are in copy. Some of the authors, especially for the early years, did not leave Lisbon. So they were merchants like Marchionni and Cernigi who invested in the voyages, were based in Lisbon, were ready to receive information from those who had undertaken the voyage, and then were ready to convey the information to Florence or elsewhere. Other letters have been written from India or traveling, either often to relatives, partners, or let's call institutional recipients. The letters were based on personal experience, if written by those who traveled, or by narratives by trusted people. So Marchionni, for example, had his own representative on board the ship, and when the ship returned, he was writing to Florence with information that he had from his agent. All the authors belong to a mercantile environment. The type of information they convey is similar, but there are differences depending on the recipient. So whether the recipient is a friend, a partner, or an institutional recipient. Also, depending on where the letter is written from, if it's written from India or if it's written from Lisbon, for example. And also depending on the date, because especially in the first letters, in addition to descriptions of things, of population that have been seen, also some stereotypes appeared. Stereotypes driven by the cultural background of the writer. Later on, obviously, when more and more information were collected, more observations were made. Let's say this sort of classical background was abandoned, and the information adhered to reality much more. But if we compare this information with other sources, we can say that these documents are generally reliable. Florentines were obviously very, very excited, as were the Portuguese, when these voyages were completed. When Vasco da Gama returned to Lisbon in 1499, Girolamo Cernigi, who was there, wrote to Florence that I reckon that all the world's wealth had been found, and there is nothing else to be found. And the comments that Florentines made in this early stage, a lot of them, let's say, in a sense, were also against the Venetians. So the Florentines saw the perspective of taking over from the Venetians the role of distributor of spices in Europe. Some of the comments are even nastier than this, but I just cite one comment by Marchionni because this allows me to introduce the final part of this presentation, which is about Marchionni. But one comment by Marchionni relating to the perspective of the trade, therefore, were that here in Lisbon, think that through this route, it will be possible to sell spices to all the West, and in time also to Italy. And this will disturb immensely the Venetian and even more the Sultan. So I conclude by talking about Marchionni in the next 5 minutes or so. Marchionni, even in his time and just after, was recognized as a very important merchant. So if you read Barge, Correa, Goes, everyone describes Marchionni as very rich merchant, very active in many fields. And even Albuquerque wrote in one of his cartas that he relied on Marchionni and his colleague or his employee Leonardo Nardi much more than in all the fittores of the India. So Marchionni was really considered one of the leading merchants of this period. Not only foreign merchant, but for merchants in general. To reconstruct the life and activity of Marchionni, which, as I said, is not, I wouldn't say it's a research or a book on Marchionni, but more broadly, it's a book about the early stages of the Carrera de India. I had to resort to different sources. Also, depending on the period, on the stage of life, let's say, of Marchionni. He was born in Florence in 49 or 50. Obviously, for the first 20 years, he lived in Florence, so the sources there are all Florentines. We have fiscal, genealogical collections, or the Cambini accounts, because in 66, Marchionni became an employee of the Cambini. Then in 1470, he moved to Lisbon. So Portuguese sources also begin to appear, and especially there are a series of privileges in the Chancelleria of various kings. But also his activity is also accounted for still in the Cambini accounts, because until 1482 he was, as I said, a representative of the Cambini. He was active on a wider landscape, in a sense, not only in Portugal, and in fact, he, with 2 other Florentines, obtained privileges in Spain as well, and therefore there is a privilege in the Archivo Municipal of Seville. His daily life, not much about his daily life, let's say his life, family, houses in Lisbon are only documented in Portuguese sources. Various collections in Torre do Tombo, in the National Library of Portugal, but also there is something in the Santa Casa da Misericordia d'Almada, because he, in addition to having houses in the Rua Nova in Lisbon, he had also a quinta in Almada, and so there is a document about this. he did not completely cut his links with Florence, and therefore some documentation is still kept in Florence. For example, he was an intermediary for Queen Leonor's patronage of a Florentine convent. So the archive of this convent preserves letters written by Marchionne, let's say on behalf of the Queen, who was sending sugar or spices to the nuns of this convent. Marchionne's trade was, let's say, at two different levels, in a sense, European, Atlantic, and then it was Asian. For all these activity, again, documentation is scattered. There are scattered information in the Torre do Tombo, and obviously it is lucky that it is possible to search on the, let's say, digital inventories of the Torre do Tombo, because otherwise it would be impossible to really find these scattered documents. But then other activity is documented in the Cambini accounts, and also in accounts of Florentine merchants based in Lyon, in Bruges, in Florence, who used Marchionne as their partner in Lisbon. So these merchants wanted to invest in the Carreira da India, and therefore used Marchionne. Marchionne is also known as a slave trader, not only in Portugal, and therefore we have some documents again in the Torre do Tombo, but also as an exporter of slaves to Florence, and therefore we have information on the Cambini accounts, but also to Spain, to Valencia, and to Sevilla. Finally, as I said, probably the most famous result obtained by Marchionne is its participation in the Carreira da India. There are letters written by him on the voyages. There are letters written by others mentioning his name as an investor in these voyages. And then there are the account documents of, as I said, other investors who used Marchionne as their reference in Lisbon. So they invested in the Carreira India through Marchionne, who was based in Lisbon. I'm not citing here any other document than the Italian sources, because as you see, they are many, but also you see how, again, scattered they are in Florence, Biblioteca Riccardiana, National Library, Archivio di Stato, in Pisa at the Archivio Salviati, but also outside, in Venice, in various archives, even in Mantua, in the archive of the Gonzaga court. To conclude and make some general comments, I would say that the contribution that Florentine made was manifold, in a sense that they gave a contribution in terms of geographical knowledge. They made a contribution in terms of investments, as we have seen, but also in terms of lives, so to say, because some of them died in China, as far as China in 1517, Giovanni da Empoli, Raffaello Galli, and Benedetto Pucci. Some of them died in India, or let's say more broadly Asia, Francesco Corbinelli, Piero Strozzi, Giovanni Bonagrazia, and incidentally, some of the documents concerning Piero Strozzi's estate or inheritance are also kept in Florence. So his brother, through the intermediation of a Italian merchant in Lisbon, in particular Giovan Francesco Affaitati, was able to obtain in Florence the goods that Piero Strozzi had left in India. So this also tells a lot about the efficiency, probably, of the system of the Portuguese Empire. Finally, some others died during the navigation, like Francesco Signorini, who was hanged during the voyage because he went into a dispute with the captain of the ship. The big investors like Marchionni, Cernigi, they died in Lisbon, so they never went back to Florence. And in fact, their descendants were more Portuguese than Florentines. For example, Marchionni had children from two different Portuguese women. He didn't marry them, but he legitimized his children. But his descendants were really Portuguese. They severed their connection with Florence. And it's probably for this reason that account books have not survived, nor the letters that they received. Because in other cases, when Florentine merchants abroad maintained their connection with Florence, maybe they were sent there, but they still had an headquarters in Florence, they would be sending the books back to Florence. And that's why these books have been preserved. Whereas in the case of Marchionni, Cernigi, and the others, they remained in Lisbon. So they didn't have an headquarters in Florence, and the books and letters have been have disappeared. But as I said, we can still trace their activity, but we need to make an effort and find their traces throughout European archives, in the letters they sent, or in the investments that others made through them and documented them in their own books or accounts. And with these two images of Lisbon and Florence, these are two images 50 years apart, I just conclude my presentation.